Hi, and welcome back to this tutorial series where we are going over the various options available to 5th edition campaigns within Fantasy Grounds Unity. In this video, we are going to focus on those options that are rule specific, so for this video I am only focusing on those that relate to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Every rule set is going to have its own custom set of house rules that will apply here, and while some may be consistent across rule sets, for the most part, this is where you're going to see the largest variation of all of the groupings that we have covered thus far. And the first option we're going to look at is called Attack:/Fumble/Crit tables, and it is used to enable randomized events that will happen when a creature or a player rolls a 1 or 20 on their attack rolls. Under normal circumstances, rolling a 1 on an attack roll usually means that attacker simply automatically misses, while rolling a 20 on that attack roll would turn that into a critical hit where extra damage is dealt. Fantasy Grounds Unity has implemented the optional house rule where more than just an automatic miss or rolling critical damage is executed. With this system, other events can happen that are a direct response of that roll. There are a total of 4 settings: off, fumble and crit, fumble, or crit. Off is the default. And with that off setting, it leaves it so that the house rule is turned off, so that when a player rolls a 1, then they're just simply gonna miss. Or when a player rolls a 20, then they're gonna roll the extra damage or deal double damage as defined by 5th edition. However, turning on the fumble and crit option allows for additional rolls to be completed that determine if more than just simply an automatic miss or a critical hit occurs. However, in order for this to actually function, you need to load a module, and it can be found under the module activation page, and all you have to do is look for crit. The one we're looking for is this one here. Once you load this is going to bring in critical fumble and critical hit related tables. Once loaded, when a creature or player rolls a 1 or 20 on their attack roll, then an additional 1d6 is rolled to determine if something else happens. You can tell because if you were to open up the critical hit table or this fumble table, you will see that you'll either just have a critical hit or an automatic miss when anyone rolls a 1 through a 4 in either case, or a critical hit effect will occur or a fumble effect will occur in the event that a 5 or a 6 is rolled in either case. And as you can see, that means that this isn't going to trigger an effect every single time somebody rolls a critical fumble or a critical hit. If you don't happen to have that module loaded, but you do have this setting configured, what's going to happen here is that if somebody rolls a critical fail or a critical hit, the system's going to try to find that particular set of tables that you see there under the tables listing. If it can't find them, you get an error on the screen, and it's going to look very much like this that you see on the screen at the bottom left. However, if a player happens to roll a 1 and an effect is actually triggered, then this particular table here will be used, and this table is replaceable. Because my system doesn't always go through and come up with a critical fumble when I want it to, I spent a little bit of time before starting this recording getting a handful in place. And I spent about an hour trying to get a handful of critical rolls that were actual fails, because critical hits, it's easier to simulate, and I'll show you that here in a second. But on screen, I'm scrolling through a couple of the critical fails that I ran and what their effects could actually be, just to give you a few examples. And this is with the default set of tables, not any mod-related tables. A critical hit, on the other hand, is extremely easy to go through and recreate. All I have to do is go and adjust this particular weapon metadata here for this fighter that I have on screen here, and simply make that as low as possible. 5 for me sounds reasonable in this particular case. And then what I'm going to do is this. Oops, I don't want that. I'm going to move this out of the way and quickly stack this fighter onto our field of battle. Just move them up there so that we can see them and give them the action. I'm going to have them attack this adult white dragon. And I'm just simply going to use the longsword because I adjusted the melee-based critical hit value. And as you can see, anytime I roll a value that is larger than 5, although this one's a natural 20, an additional roll is going to occur. And in this case, we had an effect. That means that when our fighter attacked that dragon, this description describes what happens as an event or a side effect of that particular critical hit. And most of these effects do take into account the kind of creature that you're actually going to be going through and attacking. So if you're attacking a creature that doesn't have a shoulder, like say a black pudding, it doesn't have a shoulder, so your fighter's going to gain an action instead. Whereas if you have a target that has a shoulder, such as a humanoid or even a dragon will have that, then you would go through and apply the effects associated with the rest of that particular description. When it comes to the fumble setting, this is only going to apply when a particular NPC or player character rolls a 1 on a d20. This way, the only thing that will happen are the potential of effects on a critical fumble, as opposed to anything that occurs if somebody rolls a 20. In relation to the 20, they're just going to do extra damage. No other event is going to happen when using this setting. When it comes to the crit setting, then what's going to happen there is that if someone rolls a 1 on a d20, it's just going to be a miss. It's an automatic miss. Whereas if somebody goes through and rolls a 20 on that d20, then they're going to do the critical damage that they are expected to do, but at the same time, there is the chance that an additional effect can now occur. And it's very similar to the one that we have on the screen here. In both cases, there are a potential of up to 20 critical fumbles and 20 critical hit-related effects that can occur, but there are mods out there that actually extend that out to about 200 and even further in some cases. I think there's one out there that does about 400. But some of those modded ones also have effects that just really don't make sense for what's happening that might not necessarily connect to the kind of attack that you made. I.e., if you made a slashing attack and then all of a sudden some random magical effect happens, because of that, it really kind of defeats the immersion of that whole combat situation. So the default set is a really good distilled grouping of effects that you can make use of that still kind of, for the most part, will relate to the kind of attack that happened. Whereas those other ones, they have a lot of high fantasy kinds of random events that can occur that just simply might not be applicable for your campaign. I still recommend you take a look at them though, because some of them are actually quite hilarious. The combat auto death rolls option is used to control whether an automatic death saving throw is made when a player's turn is activated in the combat tracker. It has two settings, on or off, with on being the default. And this is only going to come into play when a player's character is at or below 0 hit points and has not been stabilized by another party member or feature that that particular character might have. According to the rules of 5th edition, an NPC character, unless you, the dungeon master, deem that they need to be saved, by default, when they're reduced to 0 hit points, they're classified as dying or dead. Whereas a player character, you have that potential to recover them in the event that their party members can actually get to them and try to stabilize that particular character before they pass away. How this is going to work is that as the player's turn starts, Fantasy Grounds Unity, when the setting is left on, will automatically trigger a death-based saving throw roll. And that is going to be something that you will see down here at the bottom portion of the main tab. It is meant as a time-saving option, as in a lot of cases, most players who have had their characters reduced to 0 hit points are going to be very frustrated about that, and sometimes will step away from their system, whether it's to go get a drink, take a quick bio break, or whatever. It doesn't really much matter. They may not simply be there when their turn circles back around. And this is because players care about their characters. They get invested in those characters, and it's very demoralizing when that particular character of theirs has been reduced to 0 hit points. So some just simply walk away from the computer to more or less clear their head. However, if you play with that setting turned off, as their turn circles around, you're now waiting for that player to return, and thus breaking the overall flow of combat. I highly recommend that this be left on. However, players do want to be able to control whether their particular character dies or whether they survive. As such, that's the reason why the offsetting is there, because some players hate losing that kind of control. If their character is dead, they want it to be because they themselves failed to save their character, rather than the opposite in the sense that the system just automatically did it for them. So this is one of those things that you'll want to have a conversation with during session 0 in relation to what the players are going to be comfortable with. Do you care if the system is going to automatically roll that for you? Do you prefer to have it rolled by your own hands? That kind of thing. What's going to happen when the monk completes their turn is that this fighter is going to automatically roll a death save. The reason why I wanted that to do that is I wanted to show what happens on their main tab. And you will see here that they failed that death save. However, if a particular character makes their saving throws, what will happen is that their character will become stabilized. They'll still be unconscious, so I shouldn't have actually removed that effect. But they will be stable. So let me reapply those. With the setting off, however, When a particular character comes around, they're unconscious, that roll doesn't automatically happen. The character now has to go through and roll their death save. And this can be done, and let me remove all these pips. This can be done simply by clicking on this button down here. Okay, I'm confused. This system is trolling me, I swear. It's absolutely trolling me with all these natural 20s. But in any event, we can see that this particular character is no longer unconscious and they've regained 1 hit point. But you can see very quickly that if that particular player who controls this fighter is away at the time that their turn rolls around, you're waiting for them to return. Unless you yourself go ahead and pop this open and then click that saving throw roll. However, if that's a player who wants that level of control, you're going to make them upset. You're not going to have a happy player there. The combat NPC hit points option is used to toggle the difficulty of a given encounter by changing how many hit points a given NPC is going to have once they're added to the combat tracker. It has 3 possible settings: standard, max, and random, with standard being the default. With the standard option, anytime an NPC is added to the combat tracker, the quote-unquote default or average value of their hit points is going to be used as their total hit points. So if I drag another Meanlock in here, for example, you'll see that it has the exact same number of hit points that the previous one had. If I set this to max, however, and then I go ahead and drag another Meanlock into place, we can see that they now have 49 hit points. And that's because that's the maximum number of hit points that they can have. 76 plus 7 is 49. And it's designed to increase the challenge rating overall of a particular combat encounter, because if you've got a number of creatures that have their maximum number of possible hit points that they can have, that means it's going to take a little longer for players to go through those hit points before they'll either be defeated themselves or defeat all of the NPCs that they're trying to deal with. With the setting at random, there's now variation in the number of hit points that a particular creature is going to be given at the time that they're added to the combat tracker. And we can see here that this one has 34 hit points, this one has 30, and this one managed to roll 31. There's a wider range that can now come into play into the total number of hit points a particular set of creatures can have. And it doesn't matter how many of these creatures are added to the combat tracker at the same time, they will all have individualized rolls in relation to their hit points. So if you add 5 Meanlocks to this, you could theoretically have up to 5 different groupings of hit points. So for these Meanlocks, that could mean it could be as low as 13 hit points or as high as 49. Which essentially means you can have a really easy encounter or a very difficult encounter, depending on how high or how low the overall average of the total number of hit points of a given NPC group is. The combat roll a net each round option controls whether an initiative roll is completed every time the round begins. It has 2 settings, on or off, with off being the default setting. With the option on, each time the round is about to start, the players and any other creature in the combat tracker will have their initiatives re-rolled. What this will mean is that it will change the overall order of combat each and every round, thus providing a little bit of a randomness to the overall encounter. And it is possible for the creature who went last in the previous round to now go first in the next round. However, when this is set to off, the only time the initiative is rolled is when the players are asked to, when you, as the Dungeon Master, roll for all the creatures that you've added to the combat tracker, or when the NPCs are being added to the combat tracker and the system is configured to automatically roll that for them. For the remainder of the encounter, the initiative order remains the same, and would only change in respect to an NPC or player being killed, and obviously no longer being able to take part in the combat order, or an NPC or player decides to flee and manages to make it out of the area. As this is something that changes how things would work in relation to combat, and it would directly affect the players, one really should have a conversation about this option during session 0, and find out essentially what everyone is comfortable with. To show you what this looks like, I'm now about to progress this particular combat round to the next round with this setting off. And as you can see, nothing here has changed. All of the creatures and all of the PCs are in the order that they were prior to the combat round finishing, even if the new round begins. With the setting on, what's going to happen now is that when I terminate this round, it's going to automatically calculate all of the initiative rolls at the time that the round finishes, but before the next round starts. So depending on whether you have it set up so that the combat tracker automatically begins the next round, or whether it pauses at the end of that round so that you can do a couple of extra things before starting the next round. That's when that calculation happens. The damage massive system shock option is a tricky one to use, and it's designed to add unexpected events to when an NPC or player has received sufficient damage that their body really should have reacted to it in some way, shape, or form. This option has an on or an off state, with off being the default, and you'll understand why in a moment. With this setting on, if an NPC or player receives enough damage in one blow that it is equal to more than half of their total number of hit points, then a D10 is rolled and an effect is determined. Those effects can be found in the system shock table, and you can see here that there are a total of 5 possible effects. And they range from being immediately knocked down to 0 hit points and knocked unconscious, all the way through to simply removing the ability to react during a particular encounter until the end of that particular player or NPC's next turn. You could look at it as a given creature receiving so much damage in one blow that their body simply can't compensate for the impact, or is unable to immediately adjust to it, but is still able to hang on. With this setting off, it simply does not come into play at all, and a creature just simply suffers the number of hit points in damage and then moves on. So I've gone ahead and I've, let's just say, modified this ancient brass dragon, specifically their fire breath. It's supposed to be 16d6, but to ensure that I actually get a value that's going to exceed any one of these particular grouping of hit points here, I've modified this to be 25d10. So slightly unrealistic from that particular point of view, but I'm trying to ensure that something actually happens here. There we go. You can see that we had so much damage done to that Merid that a system shock roll was required. And in this particular case, they succeeded in actually saving against that particular system shock effect, if you will. I'm going to do damage to this cleric so that I can see if they will fail their saving throw without actually outright dying. Perfect. You can see here that we now have a subsequent roll here, and that there's now an effect that came into play. So they were simply reduced to 0 hit points. And we can see that that happened and that they're knocked unconscious. That's exactly what and how the system shock system comes into play. This setting is extremely risky when it comes to lower level characters, in the sense that you can actually have a player receive so much damage that they're flat out knocked unconscious, and if that whole party has that happen to them, well, then you've essentially wiped your campaign. And I've actually done that where I've completely wiped parties within the second or third session while this system was on. Generally, what I like to do is start with it off, and then as the players hit around level 5 or so, begin to turn it on. The map diagonal distance option comes into play when you plan to use in-game maps, rather than the theater of mind that you can use during encounters, and it relates specifically to character movement within that map. It has 3 settings: 1x, which is the default, 1.5x, and raw. So if I change these, you will see that those settings change. The 1x setting allows characters to move diagonally their full distance, meaning that if they had a travel speed of 30 feet, they could move up to 6 squares diagonally for a 5-foot wide square. And I can show that by having a player attempt to move from one side to the other, and you can see that they can travel 25 feet in this particular direction, and that's with the 1x setting. However, when it comes to the 1.5x setting, if a player attempts to move that extra distance there, you will see that there is now a movement penalty that now comes into play. They can only move 4 squares in the direction that they are attempting to go when it comes to diagonal distance travel. And I can show that because if we calculate that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares here before they hit 20 feet, yet it was 1, 2, 3, 4 squares here before they hit 30 feet of movement, it goes to show that there is that additional penalty when it comes to diagonal related movement. And it is kind of a little bit realistic in the sense that if you were to travel this distance, it takes more effort to travel that distance than it does to travel this distance in relation to a 5-foot by 5-foot square. With the raw distance, it's going to adjust it even further. So there's a little bit of leeway here when it comes to how far someone can actually travel. Prior to the raw setting, this was reading 30 feet when it was trying to travel this distance. Well, in this particular case, that character can actually realistically move 28.3 feet before they get to that square, which means they have about 2 feet of movement, 1.7, before they're essentially done. That would only work if you're not using a gridded system, whereas if you are using a gridded system, you're going to land in the square that is the closest square you can get to before your movement is exceeded. So the average works out that if it's the 1.5 or the raw, you're going to land on that square that I have indicated in that particular map. Whereas if you're traveling the same distance, meaning that you're only doing a 1x multiplier in relation to diagonal movement, they'll be able to get technically 2 squares further along that particular kind of travel. The party use currency weight option determines if the coins players can earn through quests and other events or via looting counts against the total carry weight a player is able to manage before they become encumbered. This has 2 settings, on or off, with on being the default setting. When on, each coin the player carries has weight associated with it, and you can see this by going to the currencies button here and looking at this WT column. You can see that there's a 0.02 pounds per coin in relation to a given coin, and they all weigh roughly the same, which actually might not be as realistic as having weight associated with a coin. With that default value, for every 50 coins a particular person is carrying, they're going to gain 1 pound of carry weight that they're moving around with. So if I were to modify this particular character sheet, take a look at the current encumbrance value down at the bottom right of the screen there. So if I add 100 coins, that's going to go up by 2 points. If I make this 1,000 coins, it's going to go up by 10. If the setting is turned off, that weight just simply goes away, and there's no weight accounted for when it comes to coins. And that kind of brings it back to the original style of Dungeons & Dragons, where players could carry around thousands and thousands of coins and not have it count against their encumbrance. The PC Attunement Slot options controls how many magical items a player can attune themselves, before they will lose the ability to attune themselves to another item, be it because they've tried to attune against a new item and they lost one of their attunements, or the attunement just simply fails because they already have too many. The setting has a total of 5 possible values. 3, which is the default, 4, 5, proficiency bonus, and then 2. And 3 is the default because that is what the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set defines as the default number of items a player can attune themselves to. And that doesn't mean that you can't use additional magical items as long as they don't require attunement. So the numerical representation indicates the number of items. So 2 would be 2 items, 3 is 3 items, 4 is 4 items, 5 is 5 items, and so on. When it comes to the proficiency bonus option, though, that allows your particular character the ability to scale the number of items up that they can actually attune themselves as they themselves continue to level up because they're becoming much more experienced with being able to deal with magical items. So initially you would be able to attune yourself to 2 items at the lower levels, but as your character levels up, that could become a total number of 6 items at the higher levels. I've gone ahead and thrown a number of magical items on this monk character here, and what you will see is that there is a column here under your inventory tab that represents attunement. When a magical item requires attunement, there will be a pip that pops up here. And that pip controls whether the magical benefits associated with that item can come into play. There is a catch though. You'll notice that I have the setting set to 3 items, yet I can theoretically check up to 4 items here, although you will get a warning here. Now, whether that means that Fantasy Grounds is going to disable the effects of all of those other items, I honestly don't know. There's no indication that I've been able to identify yet as to whether that actually happens or not. But at least you get a warning. So you need to go through and make sure that, I'm going to attune myself to this particular amulet and then unattune myself from these gloves. That's what you as a player would have to do. Now, obviously, if the number is set to 4, then that error goes away. Or if it's set to the proficiency bonus, you will see that I can now theoretically attune myself to 2 additional items here. The PC Encumbrance option changes how the total amount of weight a player carries can come into play. This has 2 settings, standard and variant, with the standard being the default option. The standard option simply allows a maximum weight to come into play in relation to how much a particular character can actually go through and carry with them. This is once again visible at the bottom portion of the inventory tab of your character sheet. While the effects themselves will not automatically be applied to your particular character, because for some reason Fantasy Grounds is unable to do that, you need to consider it when the current amount of content you're carrying or total weight that you're carrying is equal to or exceeds the maximum your character can actually carry. However, that does change slightly when you're going through and using the variant rule. When that is enabled, you now get an encumbered, a heavy, and a maximum category in relation to encumbrance. And this means that a given character can carry a total amount of weight that is less than the actual weight defined by the encumbered display here before they are classified as encumbered. Whereas if the character is carrying more than what is under the heavy category here, or equal to, I should say, then they are heavily encumbered, which means a different set of effects is going to come into play. And all this variant does is introduce an additional effect in between going from not encumbered to encumbered, because this encumbered value here, so if someone is carrying more than 45 pounds, or specifically this monk is carrying more than 45 pounds, they are encumbered and therefore their movement will be reduced by 10 feet. Whereas if the character is carrying more than 90 pounds of equipment, or the variant rule is not coming into play and the character has reached their maximum amount of weight that they can carry, they will have their movement speed reduced by 20 feet, and they will now begin to suffer disadvantage on ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws that utilize their strength, dexterity, or constitution-based modifiers. But regardless, neither of those effects would be applied to a given character who's suffering those particular encumbrance effects, so the Dungeon Master is going to have to go through and deal with that after the fact. The PC healing variance option changes how players heal their characters in relation to rest periods. This has 3 possible settings: standard, which is the default option, healing surges, and slow natural healing. And you can see that when I cycle through each of these particular options. With the standard option, healing during rest periods works via the defined rules of 5th edition in that the player can regain all of their character's hit points during a long rest, as well as half the number of hit die that they might have used while healing themselves during a short rest earlier in the day. This means that if a character had a maximum number of 10 hit dice and they spent 5 of them during a particular short rest earlier in the day, they'd regain 2 hit dice back during that long rest, in addition to having all wounds healed. However, if the healing surge setting is used, things change quite dramatically. The first change is that characters will no longer regain any hit points during a long rest, but instead regain all of their spent hit dice, while a short rest allows a character to only regain 25% of their hit dice back. The need to use hit dice is no longer limited to a rest period, and it is now something that can be done during a combat scenario as an action or a bonus action if they're using a variant of the variant rule. This means there is now a non-magical healing option that can be used during those combat encounters, and it works like this. The player can use an action, or the bonus action as I indicated earlier, and begin to roll hit dice to regain hit points, and can keep rolling until they've either finished healing themselves or they've spent half of their total number of hit dice, whichever comes first. However, this is something that can only be used between rests, meaning that once used, a short or long rest is needed to be completed before they will be able to do it again. During a short rest, a player can regain up to 25% of their total number of maximum hit dice back. So if a level 10 character is resting, they can regain up to 2 hit dice back, whereas a level 12 character would be able to regain 3. The slow natural healing option changes this even further, and this rule is quite confusing to understand. Once again, the player character does not regain any hit points during the rest period, regardless of whether it's a short or a long rest, but utilizes hit dice in order to recover any hit points. There is no limit to how many hit dice someone can spend, so if a character has 10 hit dice, then 10 hit dice can be spent. However, recovery is a little bit different, and it doesn't matter if it's being done during a short or a long rest. During a long rest, the original rule for hit die recovery still applies, and there is no adjustment to that rule as it's not being mentioned as part of the variant description for natural healing. This means that a level 10 character would be able to regain 5 hit die during a long rest. However, there's now a bit of a chicken and the egg issue here, because your character requires hit die in order to heal, but at the same time hit die recovered during a long rest. What happens first? There is something that you have to think about, and that is because both the hit dice recovery rule and the hit point recovery variant for slow natural healing specify that both of those finish at the end of a long rest, What this does mean, though, is there is something that the Dungeon Master is going to have to rule on. For instance, let's say a level 10 player used 10 hit die to heal their character 10d8 hit points of total damage. This means they have spent all of their hit dice, well, the same resource that is being consumed at the same time it is being regained. How does that work? To me, it's exactly as it sounds. A player character is in fact gaining both hit points and their hit dice over time during that particular long rest. So the way I set up my games is as follows. The hit die recover while they're resting, and then those hit die are available to be used at the end of the duration of that long rest so that a player can go through and heal up those hit points that were technically quote-unquote recovered during that long rest. So if we return to our previous example, if a level 10 character were to use all of their particular hit die in order to go through and actually heal themselves up, at the end of that long rest, they would have no hit die remaining. But when that character starts another short rest or a long rest, those hit die start to accrue again, which means they now become available for use at the end of that particular rest period. However, that can lead into a situation of diminished returns in the sense that if a character spends 10 hit die during a particular long rest to regain hit points, and then they complete an additional long rest, they're only going to get 5 of those hit die back. That means they have to complete 2 long rests in order to regain all of their spent hit die back. This can lead into situations where players might need to complete multiple long rests to both recover all of their hit points, as well as to regain all of their spent hit die that they used, getting those hit points back. Of course, that's assumed that they don't want to continue on with the rest of the campaign while they don't have those quote-unquote full abilities of being able to go and make use of all of their hit die during their next rest period. The last option that we need to go over in relation to the house rules section is called PC inspiration slots, and it affects how many inspiration points a particular player has, or to be more accurate, how many they can accrue. While I won't be going into detail about what an inspiration point can be used for, I do need to cover how they are tracked, and this is really what this option is used to control. However, even though the variant of the inspiration rule allows for players to award other players an inspiration point, in Fantasy Grounds Unity, this setting is primarily used to control how many inspiration points a particular player can have at one time. It has 3 possible settings: Standard, 2, or 3. And Standard is the default option in this particular case. If you look at the character's information sheet, in the upper right corner here, you're going to see an INSP header, and then a little pip just below that. That is the total number of inspiration points that a character can have. If I go through and I increase this particular setting here, you will see that additional pips pop up. If a player starts to gain inspiration points because they were awarded it, what will happen is that a star will now appear in their token in the upper left corner of the screen here. And if you're using the standard rule, that's all that will be displayed there is simply a star. But if you're utilizing the variant, and a player can gain more than a single inspiration point, what will actually begin to happen is that a numerical value will appear in that star, and it will indicate how many inspiration points they actually have. And then as a player begins to use them, that number will slowly decrement, and eventually the star will go away once they've used their last point. It's not an overly complicated concept to consider and use. You just need to figure out which setting you want to actually enable. But this does bring us to the end of this section for the house rules. So let's go ahead and move on to the next video in the series.